Eduardo de Alencaster had grown up surrounded by everything most people spend their entire lives chasing. He inherited wide lands, a respected name, and a solid fortune built across generations. From an early age, he learned how to command, how to be obeyed, how to never be questioned. But none of that prepared him for the day he lost, the only person who had ever looked at him without measuring what he owned. His wife's death wasn't just a loss. It was a violent break from the last certainty he still carried about love. She had gotten sick quietly, refusing to become a burden. In her final days, she held Eduardo's hand with a strength that didn't match her fading body, as if she needed to remind him, again and again, that she was still there. And when she finally slipped away, she took with her a lightness he hadn't realized he depended on so completely. On the day of the funeral, a thin rain fell like a veil over the cemetery. Eduardo stood still before the open grave, while people cycled through carefully chosen words of sympathy. Many cried, but few truly suffered. In fact, some didn't hide what they were really thinking at all. Eduardo saw it in the lingering looks that lasted too long, in the whispered conversations that stopped when he turned his head, in the way certain families moved closer than necessary, as if grief were an opening to step through. It wasn't just mourning in the air, it was expectation. And in that moment, something hurt him more deeply than death itself. For many of them, his pain was merely a pause and interval before a new opportunity. When the last handful of dirt fell onto the coffin, Eduardo felt something inside him harden. That night, back at the estate, he walked the empty hallways like a man trapped inside his own life. The house was too quiet, too large, too aware of her absence. The echo of his footsteps felt like a cruel reminder. He was alone, and the world was already moving on. He entered the bedroom, where everything remained exactly as she had left it. He touched the objects she used. He sat on the edge of the bed, and for the first time since childhood, he cried, without caring who might hear. It was there, inside that grief, that he made his oath. Eduardo decided he would never again be loved for what he had. If he ever allowed love back into his life, it would be love for the man beneath the title, not for the fortune surrounding him. Over the next few days, he moved with an ice-cold kind of clarity. He placed the management of his properties in the hands of a loyal administrator, separated a small sum for basic survival, and chose simple, worn clothing that felt almost foreign against his skin. He abandoned the family crest, the formal garments, the weight of his name. Before dawn, he left without announcements. He chose a distant village far enough that no one would recognize his face or connect him to the world he came from. A small place where life moved slowly, where people believed they knew each other completely. Eduardo arrived with a modest bag and a false story. Now he was simply Eduardo, a man with no land, no guarantee, no safety. In the first days, he tried to work on farms, in workshops, at storage houses. Occasionally, a door opened, but most closed quickly once people realized he had no backing, no respected family, no money to smooth over doubts. And Eduardo began to learn what poverty really meant. It wasn't just not having coins. It was the way people stopped meeting his eyes, the way their voices shortened, the way patience disappeared as if it were a luxury meant only for those who could pay. For the first time in his life, Eduardo wasn't someone who was just there. At night, alone in the small rented room, he realized how naive he'd been. Pretending to be poor was easy in theory. Living it, even as an illusion, required a kind of endurance he had never developed. Still, he didn't quit. He hadn't come for comfort. He had come for truth. And then, on an ordinary morning at the market, his eyes found someone who would change everything. She sat in a quiet corner, a basket of clothing beside her, and a needle steady between her fingers. She worked with focus, without drawing attention, as if she had learned that the less she was noticed, the less she would be hurt. Her name was Helena. Eduardo didn't know it yet. He only knew that, unlike everyone else, she didn't look at him with curiosity or judgment. In fact, she didn't seem to look at him at all. And strangely, that was what struck him the most. Eduardo started watching Helena before he ever spoke to her. Not out of strategy, but out of genuine curiosity. There was something about her that didn't match the quiet contempt she seemed to receive. Every day, at the same hour, Helena arrived at the market with a basket of clothes and her sewing tools. She always sat on the same worn wooden bench beneath the uneven shade of an old tree. She worked without lifting her head much, as if the world around her were nothing but noise. And Eduardo began to notice patterns. Some women passed by without greeting her. Some people lowered their voices when she approached. Certain glances carried judgment even when no one spoke it out loud. The rejection Helena lived with wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was daily, constant, normalized. One day, Eduardo overheard two women speaking while pretending to examine fruit. "It's better not to mix with her," one said, with her, "Never." The other replied, as if it were obvious. No one avoided her for no reason. They didn't even bother to explain the reason. In that village, reputations didn't need proof. They only needed repetition. That same day, Eduardo decided to speak to her. He approached slowly, careful not to invade her space. "Good morning," he said quietly. Helena lifted her eyes just enough to register him as a customer. Her gaze was alert, but tired, like someone who had learned to measure people without trusting them. "Good morning," she replied. "Do you need something repaired?" Eduardo hesitated. He didn't, truly, but he answered anyway. "Maybe a shirt. It's worn." She held out her hand with the ease of routine. "Let me see." Her fingers examined the fabric with calm skill. No rush, no unnecessary curiosity. "It'll be ready tomorrow," she said. "The price is simple," Eduardo agreed. The next day, he returned. Helena handed him the shirt folded carefully. The stitching was discreet but strong. "It's better than before," he said. Helena only nodded. "I do what I can." There was no smile, no false humility, just a statement of fact. After that, Eduardo started showing up more often, sometimes with clothes to repair, sometimes with no real reason. He'd sit nearby in silence, as if he had nowhere else to be. Helena didn't seem bothered, but she didn't invite him closer either. Their first real conversation happened unexpectedly. One late afternoon, sudden rain emptied the market. People ran for cover. Helena stayed, trying to protect the clothes with a cloth. Eduardo stepped in without asking. He held the fabric above the basket, keeping it dry. "Thank you," Helena said, genuinely surprised. It was the first time her gratitude sounded personal. "I didn't want your work to get ruined," he replied. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. "You're not from here," Helena said after a while. "No," Eduardo confirmed. "I arrived recently." "You can tell," she said. "People born here learn early not to insist." Eduardo felt the weight of the words. Insist on what? Helena paused. Her hand stilled for a moment, as if the answer cost more than she wanted to pay. On being seen, something tightened in Eduardo's chest. Because he was living poverty by choice, Helena wasn't. In the days that followed, their conversations became more frequent, still brief, but honest. Eduardo learned Helena had lost her parents young and had been raised by relatives who never hid how inconvenient her existence felt. Work had not been a choice, it had been survival. She didn't complain. She just stated facts with the calm of someone who had stopped expecting fairness. "I've thought about leaving," she admitted once. "But everywhere you go, someone still has to be the person no one chooses." Eduardo didn't know what to say. He began to realize that while he was testing the world, Helena was surviving it. Rejections continued. Eduardo approached families with the clear intention of finding a companion, and the answers came polite, yet final. "A man without guarantees isn't a safe choice. Our daughter deserves stability." Love doesn't fill a table. Helena watched from a distance, never commenting, never showing jealousy, never asking questions. One night, Eduardo realized something that unsettled him. He cared what Helena would think if she saw him give up. There were no declarations yet, no dramatic confessions, but something more dangerous had already formed. And respect, when it grows in harsh soil, tends to sink deep roots. As weeks passed, Eduardo sensed there was something Helena never put into words. It wasn't only shyness or quiet resignation. It was constant vigilance, like someone always prepared to lose what little she had. She smiled rarely, and when she did, it was cautious. She didn't allow herself excitement. She didn't build expectations. She lived as if hope were a risk. One afternoon, with the market nearly empty, Eduardo noticed an old scar on Helena's wrist. Not large, but visible especially against the careful delicacy of her hands. "Was that an accident?" he asked, regretting the question immediately. Helena hesitated. Her fingers tightened around the needle. "It was a lesson," she said after a moment. Eduardo didn't press, but the answer followed him like a shadow. That night, alone in his small rented room, he thought about the stories people carry, stories never told. Some hidden by shame, some by exhaustion, some because no one had ever cared enough to listen. In the days that followed, Helena began little by little to lower her guard. Not because she fully trusted Eduardo, but because his constant presence demanded nothing in return. He didn't promise, he didn't pry, he didn't try to rescue her. Trust grew from the absence of pressure. On a windy afternoon, Helena spoke more than usual. She talked about childhood, a small home, parents who had once made her feel safe, and then illness that took them both too quickly. She said she was 12 when she became alone in the world. "I went to live with relatives," she said without emotion. "They gave me a roof, and made it clear that was already more than I deserved." Eduardo's stomach tightened. She explained she began working early first, helping in kitchens, then sewing. There had never been time to dream of anything else. Survival came first. "I learned quickly not to take up space," she said. "People who take up space get sent away." It sounded less like a comment and more like a verdict. Then she spoke briefly of the man she had loved once. She didn't say his name. She didn't mark the date. She only said that, for a short time, she believed she might be chosen. that maybe she had the right to something beyond survival. When he realized I had no dowry, no protection, no guaranteed future. Everything changed, she said, eyes fixed on her stitching. He wasn't cruel, he just left. Eduardo felt a quiet anger rise not only at that man, but at a world that taught people to love with calculations. The village gossip never stopped. Some said Helena had problems, others implied there was something wrong with her. No one could explain it clearly, yet everyone repeated it. It was easier to believe suspicion than to face their own cruelty. Then the public humiliation arrived without warning on an ordinary day. During the fair, a merchant known for arrogance complained loudly about an adjustment Helena had done. He said she was incompetent, that trusting her was always a mistake. Then he threw coins on the ground in front of everyone. "That's what you're worth," he declared, laughing. The market went silent. Some people looked away. Others watched with curiosity. No one stepped in. Helena didn't move. Not out of pride, but out of fatigue. It had happened before. She knew reacting would only stretch out the pain. Then Eduardo stepped forward, not with shouting, not with threats, just with presence. He knelt slowly and pushed the coins back with his hand. "There are things that can't be measured that way," he said, his voice controlled but firm. The merchant laughed, calling him foolish, poor, nobody. Eduardo absorbed every insult without returning one. But Helena didn't forget the gesture. That night, she cried alone, not from sadness, but from something dangerously close to relief. For the first time, someone stayed. Eduardo, meanwhile, felt the weight of his lie becoming heavier. Defending Helena had been natural. Hiding who he was beginning to feel like a slow betrayal. He realized the feeling growing between them was no longer part of a test. It was real. And the more real it became, the more dangerous the truth became. After the incident at the fair, something irreversible shifted between Eduardo and Helena. There were no declarations, no promises spoken aloud, yet the silence between them was no longer empty. It had become heavy with meaning. Helena began to see Eduardo differently. He was no longer just a poor, kind man who showed up at the market each day. There was a quiet firmness about him that didn't match his fragile position in the village, a dignity that did not come from circumstance, but from character. Eduardo, on the other hand, felt increasingly divided. Every act of care, every longer conversation made the lie harder to sustain. He was no longer testing love. He was living something real, something he had never experienced before, not even in his marriage. One evening, they sat by the small stream that crossed the village. The sky was clear, and the water reflected the stars with gentle movement. "You never talk about your past," Helena said, breaking the silence. Eduardo felt his heart race. "There's not much to tell," he replied carefully. "There always is," she said. "Some people just don't want to remember." She didn't insist, but her gaze stayed on him long enough for him to feel the weight of what he wasn't saying. And the days that followed, they began walking together through the village, not holding hands, but side by side. That closeness was enough for the comments to grow louder. "He's not a good match. She never learns. Two rejected people don't make a future." Eduardo heard it all. Helena pretended not to, but alone at night, she wondered whether she was repeating an old mistake believing in someone, with no guarantees. The moment love revealed itself came quietly. Helena fell ill. Nothing serious, but enough to keep her from working for several days. Her absence at the market went unnoticed by most, but not by Eduardo. He brought food, water, simple medicine. He sat beside her bed in silence, respecting her space. "You don't have to stay," Helena murmured once. "I know," he answered, "but I want to." The words lingered between them. That night, Helena realized she was no longer alone, and that realization frightened her more than it comforted her. When she recovered, something inside her had shifted. She allowed herself to smile more, to speak more, to hope quietly. Eduardo, however, grew more restless. The lie was eating away at him. He knew that telling the truth might cost him everything, but he also knew that continuing the lie meant building love on fragile ground. The conflict became unbearable when a stranger arrived in the village. A well-dressed man on a strong horse, observant and reserved. He didn't blend in. He watched. He asked questions. Eduardo recognized him instantly. The past was approaching. That night, Eduardo didn't sleep. He paced the dark room, remembering the oath he had made months earlier. He realized the test had escaped his control. He was no longer searching for an answer. He already had it. Helena loved him without knowing who he was, and that truth both saved him and condemned him. The well-dressed man did not go unnoticed for long. In a village where little ever changed, any difference became immediate conversation. People observed, from a distance, speculated, invented stories long before knowing the truth. Eduardo tried to avoid him. He changed routes, left at different hours, stayed away from the market, not out of fear, but because he wasn't ready to shatter the fragile peace he still had with Helena. But the past does not accept postponement. One morning, the stranger was seen talking to the tavern owner, then to a merchant, then to one of the village leaders. Eduardo's name had not yet been spoken aloud, but it was already moving through whispers. Helena noticed the change. Eduardo was distant, quieter than usual. He avoided long conversations, as if afraid of saying the wrong thing. That emotional absence awakened an old fear in her, the fear of being abandoned without explanation. "Are you all right?" she asked one afternoon as they walked near the stream. "I am," he replied too quickly. She didn't press, but the silence hurt. That same night, the stranger knocked on Eduardo's door. He didn't ask permission. He didn't pretend surprise. "We've been looking for you for a long time," he said quietly. "You shouldn't have come this far." Eduardo closed his eyes for a moment. He had known this moment would come, but not like this. "Not here," Eduardo said. "Not this way. It's already done," the man replied. "The whole village is talking." When the man left, Eduardo stood still for a long time. He felt cornered. Running was still possible. Telling the truth was also possible, but every choice carried irreversible consequences. The next day, everything surfaced. Not directly but cruelly. During the fair, someone mentioned out loud that an important man was hiding among them. Another laughed, saying it was impossible. Then the word was spoken. Baron. The market went silent. Helena heard it like a physical blow. She turned slowly, searching for Eduardo among the people. She found him standing still, pale, unable to move. All eyes turned toward him. "Is it true?" someone asked. Eduardo didn't answer. The silence confirmed everything. Helena felt the ground disappear beneath her feet. She didn't run. She didn't scream. She simply walked away. Later, alone in her small house, she heard footsteps approaching. Eduardo stopped at the doorway, not entering. "I can explain," he said, his voice broken. She waited, then explained. She finally said, without emotion. Eduardo told her everything. The oath, the disguise, the test. Each word seemed to stretch the distance between them. When he finished, silence filled the room. "So, everything was a test," Helena said at last. "Every gesture, every word, every silence." "Not you," Eduardo said desperately. "Never you." She smiled, but there was pain in it. "It was exactly with me." She stood. "What hurts most," she continued, "isn't that you're rich? It's that you let me believe I was chosen." When I was being evaluated, Eduardo stepped forward. Helena stepped back. "I loved you when you had nothing," she said. "Now I have to learn how to live, knowing you always had everything." She opened the door. "Leave." Eduardo left. The village reacted instantly. Those who once ignored him now greeted him warmly. Doors opened. Invitations appeared. Women who had rejected him now smiled with renewed interest. Eduardo refused all of it. Nothing made sense without Helena. She left the village days later. No announcement. No goodbye. Just departure carrying the pain of once again being the last to know. Eduardo stayed behind. Rich again. Respected again. And emptier than ever. Helena left before dawn. She took few belongings, some clothes, her sewing tools, and what courage remained to begin again. She left no note. She knew that if she looked back, she might not have the strength to continue. The road was long and quiet. Each step seemed to take her farther not only from the village, but from the woman who had dared if only briefly to believe she could be chosen. She went to a place where no one knew her, a small city, larger than the village she left behind. Their anonymity was not punishment, it was protection. The first days were restless. Sleep came in fragments. At night, memories, surface gestures, shared silences, Eduardo's quiet kindness that now felt painfully contradictory. She refused to give in to longing. Work became her refuge. She offered simple repairs, then began sewing for small shops. Her skill stood out not because of perfection, but because of devotion. Helena sewed as if trying to hold things together, even when the fabric had already begun to tear. Slowly, she earned respect, not affection at first, but recognition. For the first time, she was seen for what she did, not for what people whispered. Still, nights were hard. Sometimes anger returned, sometimes sadness, and sometimes most dangerous of all memory came with understanding. She fought it. Meanwhile, Eduardo remained in the village, but no longer belonged there. The fortune surrounded him again. Invitations returned. Marriage proposals arrived quickly as if they had always been waiting. He refused them all. Nothing made sense. Guilt became his constant companion. Not dramatic guilt, but the quiet kind that settles into daily life. He saw Helena everywhere. The empty market bench, the tree's shadow, the silence of the evenings. He realized he had lost something that could not be bought back. He tried to justify his choices by remembering his oath, but now he understood. Testing love was still a form of control, and control was never love. Months passed. Eduardo began using his wealth differently. He invested in the village, created work opportunities, supported families he once ignored. Not as public redemption, but as personal necessity. Still, nothing filled the void. One night, sorting through old belongings, he found a mended shirt. He recognized the firm, careful stitches immediately. Helena, that simple object brought painful clarity. He didn't need to prove anything anymore. He already knew who she was, and he knew who had failed. That was when he made his decision. He would not search for Helena to demand forgiveness. He would not try to persuade her. First, he needed to become someone worthy of the choice she had made when he had nothing. Helena, meanwhile, was changing. In the new city, she was invited to teach sewing to young apprentices. She hesitated at first, but accepted. As she shared fragments of her story, she discovered something unexpected. Her pain could shelter others. The rejected woman was becoming a reference, and that frightened her, because growth meant, inevitably, deciding whether the past still had a place in her life. For Helena, the days were long and demanding, but meaningful. The small room where she taught sewing began to fill with young women, some as insecure as she once had been. There, Helena was no longer the rejected one. She was the teacher, the reference, the woman who knew how to turn scraps into something useful. She rarely spoke about herself. When she mentioned the past, she did so in fragments, as if still protecting a sensitive wound, but her students noticed. There was something in her posture that revealed a woman who understood the pain of never being chosen, and that understanding created trust. Helena began to see herself differently, not because others told her she had value, but because she finally allowed herself to recognize it. Sadness still existed. So did longing. But now there was something new, emotional independence. She no longer needed to be chosen in order to exist. Eduardo, on the other hand, sank into a routine of work and silence. He resumed responsibilities he once delegated. He visited properties, spoke with workers, listened to stories he had never taken the time to hear before. The closer he came to ordinary people, the more he realized how distant his former life had been from reality. He didn't seek applause. He avoided praise. Soon, he was seen as a strange man, wealthy, yet simple, powerful, yet discreet. Many didn't understand his transformation. Some assumed it would pass. Eduardo didn't care. Every action was an attempt to rebuild himself away from the lie he had created. At night, Helena returned to his thoughts with painful clarity. He didn't idealize her. He remembered his own failures, his silences, his decision to test something that should never have been tested. He accepted the possibility that he might never see her again, and that acceptance ironically was what finally made him honest with himself. The reunion began to take shape indirectly. A merchant casually mentioned to Eduardo a woman teaching sewing in another region. He spoke of her skill, her firm posture, the respect she commanded. Eduardo didn't ask her name. He didn't need to. That same week, Helena heard of a baron who had changed a man who refused advantageous alliances, invested in dignified work, and walked among laborers as an equal. She didn't ask his name either, but she felt it. Both sensed that fate was drawing closer, even though neither had the courage to take the first step. Helena wondered whether love could exist without submission, whether it was possible to love someone without losing oneself. Eduardo wondered whether true love sometimes required giving up one's own desire. The questions matured. The answers did not. The decisive moment began to form when Helena received an unexpected invitation to participate in a larger project, funded by an anonymous benefactor, aimed at teaching sewing to underprivileged communities in several regions. She accepted. She didn't know who was behind it. Eduardo, when authorizing the project, didn't know Helena would be among those involved. Both walked separately toward the same place. The reunion was not immediate. Helena arrived in the new region with a group of women participating in the project. The place was simple but organized, with workshops being set up for professional training. Everything functioned with care and respect her enough to catch her attention. In the first days, Helena focused entirely on work. She organized materials, guided students, structured lessons. She felt useful, necessary. Whole Eduardo followed the project from a distance. He avoided appearing without reason. He knew their paths would cross sooner or later, but he didn't want to force anything. This time itself had to be an ally. The meeting happened on an ordinary morning. Helena walked across the courtyard carrying fabrics when she heard a voice giving instructions to a group of workers. She stopped. The tone was too familiar to be coincidence. She turned slowly. Eduardo was there, thinner, with signs of fatigue on his face, dressed simply, despite the position he held. For a moment, neither moved. There was no exaggerated surprise, no shock, just recognition. "I didn't know you were involved," Eduardo said, breaking the silence. "Neither did I know you were funding this," Helena replied calmly. Their tone was different from the past. There was no accusation, no expectation. They spoke little that first day. They kept a respectful distance. The past still weighed too heavily to be treated casually. In the days that followed, however, interaction became inevitable: meetings, decisions, visits to the workshops. Eduardo observed Helena with silent admiration. She had grown, she didn't seek approval, she didn't diminish herself. Helena, in turn, saw a transformed Eduardo. He listened more than he spoke. He didn't impose. He didn't hide behind his title. The decisive conversation happened at dusk, when the courtyard was empty. "I didn't come here to ask you for anything," Eduardo said. "I know I lost the right to do that." Helena looked at him for a long moment. "I didn't come here expecting to find you," she replied, "but I won't pretend nothing existed." Silence stretched between them. "You taught me a lot," Eduardo continued, "and I know I learned it the hardest way." Helena took a deep breath. What hurt wasn't the lie, she said. It was realizing that once again, I didn't control the choice. Eduardo nodded. "Today, you do," he replied, "and I will respect whatever decision you make." Those simple words, free of pressure, touched something deep within her. But Helena still needed time, not to forgive but to choose without fear. After the reunion, Helena kept emotional distance. She remained polite, professional, firm. She spoke with Eduardo only when necessary, always in practical contexts. To many, it looked like indifference. To her, it was protection. She knew the feeling still existed. Denying it would be lying to herself. But now she understood something she hadn't before. Loving did not mean placing herself second. Eduardo respected the silence. He didn't insist. He didn't appear without reason. He didn't try to persuade her with beautiful words. And that was precisely what began to matter. The project grew quickly. More women joined. The workshops began operating full-time. Helena became central to everything. Her leadership was natural, ever authoritarian, always rooted in example. One day, a serious problem threatened the project. A group of investors wanted to take control, demanding changes that would place the women back into dependency. They wanted quick results, mass production, profit above purpose. Eduardo was pressured. Accepting the terms would mean more money, more influence, more recognition. Refusing would put everything at risk. Helena learned of the situation through others. She didn't seek Eduardo. She didn't ask for anything. She simply continued working, prepared to lose everything again. At the decisive meeting, Eduardo listened in silence. Then he refused. "This project does not exist to exploit anyone," he said firmly. "If it cannot exist with dignity, then it will not exist at all." The investors withdrew. The risk was real. For weeks the project's future was uncertain. Eduardo used his own resources to keep it alive without publicizing it. Helena discovered this by chance. When she learned the truth, she went to Eduardo. "Why did you do this?" she asked. "Because some things cannot be negotiated," he replied. "And because I never wanted you to have to choose between your principles and survival." "Not again." Helena stood silent for a long time. There was no test there, no calculation, no performance. There was choice. She understood then that Eduardo was no longer the man who had pretended to be poor to test love. He had learned to love without control. That night, Helena walked alone. She thought about everything she had lost, everything she had built on her own, and everything she could now share without disappearing. The next morning, she went to Eduardo. "I haven't forgotten what happened," she said, "and I won't pretend it didn't hurt." Eduardo nodded. "But I also can't pretend I don't see who you've become," she continued. She took a deep breath. "If we try again, it will be different. There'll be no tests, no inequality, and if one day I decide to leave, it will be by choice, not by fear." Eduardo answered without hesitation. "That's everything I should have offered from the beginning." Helena extended her hand, not as surrender, but as partnership. They didn't kiss, they didn't need to. The gesture was greater than that. Love had finally stopped being a trial. It had become a decision. Their return was quiet. There were no carriages, no public celebrations, no speeches. They returned the way they had learned to live together, with simplicity, respect, and conscious choice. The village changed before it fully realized it. Some residents watched with curiosity, others with surprise. There were still those who carried judgment in their eyes, but it no longer held the same power. Helena walked with her head held high, not because she was protected by a title, but because she no longer needed to make herself smaller to belong. She continued working, now coordinating workshops that employed women from the village itself, including some who had once ignored her. There was no revenge, no confrontation, only presence. Eduardo remained discreet. He didn't use his name to impose respect, but he no longer hid it either. He had learned that identity does not need to be armored. People began to notice something different between them. It wasn't display. It wasn't submission. It was partnership. One afternoon, a young woman from the village, one who had once laughed at Helena, approached her shyly. "How did you know he was different?" she asked. Helena thought for a moment before answering. "I didn't know," she said calmly. "I was simply myself, and that was enough to show who he was, and who he needed to become." Eduardo overheard the conversation from a distance. In that moment, he understood that the greatest lesson wasn't finding true love, but becoming someone capable of living it without games. The wedding took place months later. It was simple, without excess, without spectacle. Only people who truly belonged to their story were present. Helena wore a dress. She had sewn herself not because she had to, but because she wanted to. Every stitch carried memory, not pain. As Eduardo watched her walk toward him, he felt something unlike anything he had known before. Not possession, not conquest, but gratitude. They didn't promise a perfect eternity. They promised honesty, dialogue, and the commitment to never again turn love into a test. Over time, their story spread. Some told it as romance, others as a lesson. Few understood the full truth. Helena was not chosen because she was the most beautiful, the richest, or the most convenient. She was chosen because she was the only one who loved when there was nothing to gain. And Eduardo was not worthy of love because he hid his wealth, but because he learned, with her, that true love is never tested. It is lived.